Welcome and settle in. As you prepare to rest, let your mind drift away from the present moment into a distant time and place. Tonight, we journey back to ancient Rome, a city of marble and dust, of endless ambition, and of strange entertainments that captivated crowds of thousands. Among the most iconic and unsettling features of Roman life were the gladiators, men trained for combat, their lives bound to the rhythm of drills, discipline, and the looming shadow of the arena. While their battles may have been staged for spectacle, the reality of their daily existence was far less glamorous than the legends suggest. Our theme this evening is the horrific truths of Roman gladiator training. But do not worry, we will approach this subject gently, steadily, with the calm detachment of a historian guiding you through old corridors of memory. There will be hardship, yes, and harsh realities. Yet we will linger also on the rhythm of their routines, the sights and sounds of the training grounds, and the curious mixture of suffering and survival that defined their world. Our journey unfolds in 4 parts. We begin with daily life inside the ludus, the gladiator school, where discipline was severe, resources scarce, and every day was shaped by the relentless demand to endure. From there, we will turn to the story of Spartacus, whose name still echoes as a symbol of defiance. After that, we will peer into the earth itself, at the archaeological traces left behind by gladiators' remains, uncovering what their bones reveal about their lives. Finally, we will contrast all of this with the luxurious banquets of Rome's elite, where the suffering of men became a form of entertainment. But first, imagine yourself standing just outside the walls of the ludus. The morning air is cool. The faint sounds of iron striking iron echo from within. A gate creaks open, and the world of gladiator training begins to unfold before you. Inside the ludus, or gladiator school, life was measured in repetition. Day after day, men woke not to freedom, but to the whistle of their instructors and the constant vigilance of guards. These schools were not merely places of learning, they were prisons designed for training. High walls surrounded the compound, their stone surfaces plain and unadorned, sealing the fighters away from the bustling city just beyond. Escape was not a possibility. The men inside came from different walks of life. Many were slaves, taken as spoils of war, transported from distant provinces where Latin was a foreign tongue. Others were criminals, sentenced to fight as punishment for their misdeeds. A rare few were volunteers, free men who chose the life of a gladiator in exchange for the promise of fame, money, or simply a different kind of existence. Yet, once inside the ludus, their backgrounds mattered little. Each man became part of the same relentless machine. The day began early. At first light, the men rose from their communal quarters. The air inside was heavy with the warmth of bodies, the smell of sweat and straw from the bedding beneath them. There was little privacy. Rows of cots, often just simple pallets, lined the chambers. Voices murmured in different accents. The shuffling of bare feet sounded against the stone floors, and outside, the trainers were already waiting. Meals were simple, designed not for pleasure, but for endurance. Bread was a constant, coarse and filling. A thick porridge, often made from barley, was ladled into bowls. Beans, lentils, and sometimes vegetables supplemented the diet. Rarely there was meat. Despite the harshness of their lives, gladiators were fed relatively well compared to ordinary slaves, for their bodies were the instruments of their trade. Strong muscles meant better performances, And so the diet was rich in carbohydrates to build bulk and strength. Water was provided in abundance, for dehydration could sap a man's will. Wine was present, though often diluted. It dulled the edge of fatigue and softened the monotony of days. Training itself was exhausting, a cycle of drills that seemed endless. Wooden swords, heavier than real ones, were pressed into their hands. The weight was deliberate, designed to strengthen the arms so that the actual weapons would feel lighter by comparison. Hour after hour, the men practiced the same motions: a downward strike, a thrust, a block, a step forward, a pivot, over and over, until the rhythm of combat became instinct, until muscles remembered what the mind no longer needed to command. Shields, too, were burdensome. Large wooden ones, often weighted, were strapped to the arm and carried until the limb ached. Men marched in circles, stood in defensive postures, and practiced advancing as though toward an unseen enemy. The sand beneath their feet clung to their skin, mixing with sweat. The sun overhead, especially in the hotter months, turned the courtyard into an oven. There was little tolerance for weakness. If a man faltered, if he slowed when others pressed forward, the trainer's whip was quick to sting across his back. The lash was not reserved for severe punishment alone, it was a daily reminder of discipline. The lanista, the master of the school, demanded obedience above all. Survival in the arena depended on precision, on stamina, on unwavering control, and the whip enforced these virtues. At times, pairs of men sparred under watchful eyes. Wooden weapons clashed with dull thuds. The sound echoed between the walls. Trainers corrected stances, barked orders, and insisted on perfection. Though the blades were blunt, accidents still happened. A mistimed strike, a shield swung too hard, and blood might bead along the skin. Wounds were treated, but not tenderly. The physician attached to the school patched injuries as efficiently as possible, for the men had to return to training swiftly. Beyond the drills, there were games of endurance. Men carried weights, ran laps around the courtyard, or pushed against one another in tests of strength. The repetition was meant to break the body and rebuild it, forging men who could last in combat even when every muscle begged for rest. The days were long, the routine unchanging. The hours blurred together into a rhythm of sweat, commands, and exhaustion. And always there was the awareness of what lay ahead. The arena loomed in their future, vast and unforgiving. Each day in the Ludos was a rehearsal for that moment. The crowd's roar could be imagined, though the men would not hear it until their day of reckoning came. For now, the sound was the crack of the whip, the scrape of sandals on sand, and the thud of wooden blades. Yet within this harshness there were small moments of humanity. A quiet word exchanged between men at the water trough, a joke whispered during a rare pause, quickly smothered when a trainer drew near. At night, in the dim glow of oil lamps, some spoke of home, of places far away, or of dreams that remained out of reach. Others lay in silence, staring at the dark ceiling, resigned to the fate that had found them. Imagine, if you will, the rhythm of such a life, the repetition of strikes, the heavy breath drawn after hours of exertion, the simple meal that filled the stomach, but did little to soothe the soul. The sound of a whip slicing through air, followed by silence, then the return to drilling. This was life in the Ludisa, life stripped of freedom, reduced to discipline and survival. And yet, from within these walls, stories would emerge. stories of men who rose above their station, who dared to resist, to understand that we must now step away from the daily grind of the training yard and follow the path of one man in particular, a gladiator whose name would outlive even the empire that sought to contain him. Among the thousands of men who passed through the gates of the gladiator schools, most left little trace in history. Their names were forgotten, their battles recorded only in fleeting graffiti or fading inscriptions. But one man's story stood apart. His name was Spartacus, and though he began as a prisoner like so many others, his journey would ripple across the centuries. Spartacus was not Roman by birth. He came from Thrace, a rugged region north of Greece, a land of mountains and warriors. The Thracians were known for their skill in combat, particularly as cavalrymen. Spartacus, too, may have once served as a soldier, perhaps even in the Roman army, though the exact details of his early life remain uncertain. What is clear is that at some point his fortunes turned. He was captured, enslaved, and brought south to Italy, where he was eventually delivered into the hands of a lanista. It was in the gladiator school at Capua, one of the most renowned in Italy, that Spartacus found himself. Capua's ludus was large, housing hundreds of fighters. The conditions there were no gentler than in other schools. Drills consumed the day, discipline was strict, and the looming promise of the arena shaped every decision. For Spartacus, this life must have felt like a casa confinement, both physical and spiritual, and yet, within the walls of Capua, something stirred. Spartacus was not alone in his discontent. Many of the men around him were restless, yearning for freedom, weary of the lash and the monotony of drills. Whispers grew among them, hushed conversations at night, furtive glances exchanged during meals. The idea of escape, dangerous as it was, began to take shape. In the year 73 BCE, the chance came. According to ancient sources, about 70 gladiators conspired together, Spartacus among them. They planned to break free, to arm themselves, and to flee beyond the reach of their captors. Not all of the men were able to join. The plan was discovered prematurely, and many were seized before they could act. But Spartacus and his companions pressed forward, armed at first with little more than kitchen knives and spits from the school's cookhouse. They forced their way out of the ludus. Once free, they scavenged for weapons, seizing wagons of gladiatorial arms intended for the arena. The rebellion had begun. At first, it may have seemed like a desperate gamble. A small band of fugitives, pursued by Roman forces, hiding in the countryside. Yet Spartacus proved to be more than just a runaway. He was a leader, a strategist, and above all, a man who could inspire others. The band of escaped gladiators grew as slaves from the surrounding regions flocked to join them. Soon, what began as a ragged group swelled into a formidable force. They made their camp on Mount Vesuvius, the same mountain that, years later, would bury Pompeii in ash. From its slopes, they could see across the fertile plains of Campania. Roman patrols sought to trap them there, but Spartacus used cunning rather than brute force. When Roman troops blockaded the mountain, the rebels devised an escape, using ropes fashioned from vines. They lowered themselves down steep cliffs where no guards expected them to move. They fell upon the Roman encampment from behind, routing the soldiers, seizing their supplies, and transforming themselves from fugitives into an army. Word spread quickly. In towns and villages, enslaved men and women whispered of Spartacus and his growing band. His rebellion was not just about survival, It became a symbol of defiance against the crushing weight of Roman slavery. Men who had long borne chains now saw a glimmer of possibility in his cause. For nearly 2 years, Spartacus and his followers roamed across Italy. Ancient writers say their numbers swelled into the tens of thousands, though the figures are difficult to confirm. Families joined the ranks, wives, children, those who could not bear to be left behind. What had begun in a gladiator school became something much larger, a movement that shook the foundations of Rome itself. The Roman Senate, at first dismissive, grew alarmed. This was no small disturbance. Legions were dispatched, commanders sent to crush the rebellion, yet again and again Spartacus's forces triumphed. His men were not trained soldiers in the Roman sense, but they fought with desperation, with the raw determination of those who had everything to gain and little left to lose. Spartacus himself showed remarkable skill, organizing his followers, maintaining discipline, and even attempting to instill a sense of justice within the camp. Ancient accounts suggest he sought to restrain unnecessary cruelty, a striking contrast to the brutality he had endured in captivity. Still, the odds were against him. Rome was vast, wealthy, and relentless. Internal divisions weakened the rebel ranks. Some wished to press northward, to escape into Gaul and freedom beyond the Alps. Others were determined to remain in Italy, raiding and resisting. Disagreements fragmented the unity of the rebellion. By 71 BCE, the Roman general Crassus took command of the campaign against Spartacus. With greater numbers, stricter discipline, and fortified defenses, Crassus slowly pressed the rebels back. The final battles were desperate, and though Spartacus fought fiercely, he fell in combat. His body was never found, swallowed into the chaos of defeat. The aftermath was grim. Thousands of captured rebels were executed, crucified along the Appian Way, the great road leading into Rome. Their bodies stood as warnings, stretching for miles a silent forest of crosses. Rome had reasserted its dominance, and slavery endured for centuries to come. Yet Spartacus's story did not fade. His name was remembered not as that of a mere gladiator, but as a symbol of resistance against oppression. Ancient writers debated his motives, some admiring, others condemning. In later centuries, poets, revolutionaries, and dreamers alike would invoke his memory. Even now, his life reminds us of how, within the harsh confines of the ludus, a man could rise beyond the whip and the sword to challenge an empire. And so, having followed Spartacus from the training grounds of Capua to the fields of rebellion, let us now shift our gaze. Beyond the legends and the written accounts, there remains another source of knowledge about gladiators, the very bones they left behind. In graves unearthed by archaeologists, silent truths are buried. By examining them, we uncover not only how gladiators lived, but how their bodies bore the weight of the lives they endured. The written accounts of gladiators, though powerful, are shaped by the pens of Roman historians, often distant from the lives they described. But the earth holds its own memory. In the quiet work of archaeologists, careful hands uncover what time has hidden. In fragments of bone, in the traces of burial grounds, a different story is told, one that speaks not through words, but through the physical record of lives lived and lives lost. One of the most striking discoveries was made in the city of Ephesus, in what is now modern-day Turkey. There, in the late 20th century, a cemetery was excavated near the site of a Roman amphitheater. Within it lay the remains of over 60 men, most between the ages of 20 and 30. The context, the location, and the nature of their skeletons strongly suggested that these were gladiators. Imagine for a moment the silence of such a place. Rows of bones lying where they were placed nearly 2,000 years ago. Soil pressed down gently over centuries, sealing them in darkness. Archaeologists brushing away the earth layer by layer, revealing fragments of skull, rib, and limb. What emerges is not just death, but the imprint of life upon the body. The skeletons tell us that gladiators were indeed well fed. Analysis of their bones revealed high levels of calcium and signs of a diet rich in grains and legumes. Barley, beans, and lentils had left their trace in the very structure of the bones. Some researchers even described gladiators as the barley men, sustained by this staple food. The diet made their bodies strong, with bones that healed well after fractures. And there were many fractures. Nearly every skeleton bore evidence of trauma. Broken arms, cracked ribs, healed skulls. These men lived lives of repeated injury. Yet the striking detail is how many of these injuries had healed before death. This suggests that gladiators received medical attention, a necessity if they were to be sent back into the arena again and again. The physicians attached to gladiator schools worked not out of compassion, but out of pragmatism. A wounded fighter was an investment that needed to be preserved. Still, not all wounds healed. Some bones showed sharp cuts consistent with fatal blows. Others revealed crushing impacts, as though struck by heavy weapons. A fractured jaw, a pierced skull, signs of the arena's violence, are etched into the skeletons, silent reminders of the spectacle that drew the Roman crowds. Beyond Ephesus, other sites have revealed similar truths. In York, in northern England, a mass grave was uncovered. Within were the remains of young men, some showing evidence of beheadings, others with muscular builds suggesting intensive training. While not every scholar agrees that they were gladiators, the possibility lingers. Their burial near an amphitheater, their physical characteristics, and their violent deaths all point toward a life shaped by combat. What is particularly telling about these burials is the care or lack thereof given to the dead. In some cases, gladiators appear to have been buried with respect, laid out neatly, sometimes even with small offerings. This suggests that for all their status as slaves or criminals, they could command a measure of dignity in death. The crowd may have seen them as mere entertainment, but within the walls of the ludus, bonds of camaraderie were strong. Companions may have ensured that a fallen fighter received at least the semblance of a proper burial. In other cases, however, the burials were hasty, the bodies deposited with little ceremony. Here, the gladiator was reduced once more to property, discarded once his purpose was served. The contrast is striking. Some graves speak of humanity, others of indifference. Together, they reveal the fragile position gladiators held, balanced between admiration and disposability. The bones also tell of age. Most gladiators did not live long. Many died in their 20s, some in their 30s. Few reached what we would call middle age. Their bodies were honed for performance, but the arena demanded a heavy price. And yet, even in their brief lives, they became symbols of strength, endurance, and spectacle. Beyond bones, inscriptions carved in stone also speak. Inscriptions were sometimes set up by fellow gladiators, commemorating a fallen comrade, with words like amicus carissimus, dearest friend. Some mention victories, the number of fights endured, or the stage name of the fighter. These were reminders not only of death, but of the individuality of the men who had once been reduced to little more than performers in Rome's theaters of blood. Archaeology thus gives us something history alone cannot, a tangible, physical sense of these lives. The bones whisper of discipline, of injury endured, of diets carefully managed, of camaraderie and cruelty intertwined. In silence, they reveal what ancient writers often ignored, the daily toll of a system built on human bodies. As you picture these graves, gently uncovered from the earth, you may also picture what lay beyond them. The amphitheaters, where crowds gathered, where senators reclined on cushioned seats, and where feasts were served as men fought and died. To complete our journey, we will turn now to that world, not the dust of the training ground, not the rebellion of Spartacus, nor the graves of the fallen, but the glittering banquets of Rome's elite, where the suffering of gladiators became part of an evening's entertainment. To understand the full picture of gladiator life, one must step beyond the ludus and the arena, into the villas and banquet halls of Rome's wealthy elite. For it was not only in public spectacles that gladiators served as entertainment. They were also woven into the private luxuries of the ruling class, becoming adornments to evenings of excess, feasts where leisure and cruelty mingled together. Picture a Roman banquet, a long dining room, richly decorated, with mosaics on the floor and painted walls depicting myths, gods, and landscapes. Couches lined the edges of the room, each draped with cushions where guests reclined. Lamps flickered with soft light, and the air carried a blend of aromas, roasted meats, spiced wines, and the faint sweetness of honey cakes waiting to be served. The banquets of the wealthy were displays of status as much as meals. Course after course arrived fish from the Mediterranean, exotic fruits carried from distant provinces, wines aged in fine amphorae. Slaves moved silently, refilling cups, adjusting lamps, clearing away dishes. Musicians sometimes played softly, their notes winding around the murmur of conversation. And yet, for some hosts, food and music were not enough. To impress their guests, they turned to spectacle. Gladiators, or fighters trained in their schools, were sometimes brought into the dining room itself. Not to fight to the death, though this could happen, but to spar, to show their skills, to provide a thrill for the reclining audience. Imagine the contrast. On one side, soft couches and platters of figs. On the other, men striking at one another with steel, their bodies gleaming with sweat under the lamplight. Such performances blurred the line between entertainment and cruelty. For the guests, the fighters were part of the evening's indulgence, no different than the imported wine or the dancing girls. For the gladiators, it was yet another reminder of their place objects of fascination, denied the dignity of choice. In some cases, the spectacle was darker. Ancient writers mention that certain banquets included executions as part of the entertainment. Condemned men, not trained gladiators, but prisoners, were killed in staged performances. While gladiators were too valuable to be wasted lightly, the idea of death as diversion was not foreign to Roman leisure. The presence of gladiators at banquets also fostered a curious paradox. On the one hand, they were despised as slaves, men stripped of status and bound to violence. On the other, they were admired, even desired. Roman women, in particular, were sometimes captivated by the allure of gladiators. Poets wrote of aristocratic women whispering the names of their favorite fighters, enchanted by the dangerous glamour of men who lived at the edge of life and death. Rings engraved with gladiator symbols have been found. tokens, perhaps, of admiration, or of a fascination that crossed social boundaries. At the height of Rome's empire, the banquets themselves became ever more extravagant. Emperors, eager to surpass one another in displays of wealth, staged feasts that lasted for days. Entire amphitheaters were transformed into dining halls. Curtains were drawn across arenas, shades stretched overhead, and the floor itself became a space for both feasting and spectacle. Gladiators fought while guests reclined at tables, the boundaries between life and leisure dissolving into a single performance of Roman power. For the elite, these spectacles affirmed their control. To watch men fight while sipping wine was to experience a form of mastery over both body and fate. The fighters were symbols of discipline, of strength forced into service, reminders of how the empire could command even the most primal aspects of human life. And so, as the banquets ended, as lamps burned low, and the guests retired to their chambers, the gladiators returned to their schools. Their bellies perhaps filled with scraps from the feast, but their fates unchanged. By dawn, they would once again stand in the training yard, lifting their wooden swords, drilling until exhaustion pressed upon them, all in preparation for the arena where the crowd's hunger never ceased. From the training yard to the rebellion of Spartacus, from the silent graves to the banquets of the elite, the life of a gladiator was always caught in tension between admiration and contempt, between survival and death, between the whip and the fleeting whisper of glory. And now, as we step back from the world of gladiators, allow the echoes of that distant past to soften. The clatter of wooden swords fades, the crack of the whip dissolves, the murmur of Roman banquets grows quiet. You are left not in the dust of the ludus, nor in the roar of the amphitheater, but here in the stillness of the present. The world of Rome was harsh, its entertainments cruel, its truths difficult. Yet for us, it remains only a memory, a distant reflection. The hardships of those men are no longer ours to bear. Instead, they remind us how far the rhythms of life have shifted. Where once survival depended on the lash and the sword, now comfort surrounds you. So breathe deeply, let the past recede, as though walking away from the high walls of the gladiator school, leaving behind the dust, the heat, and the cries of the crowd. Ahead lies only quiet, the soft rhythm of your own breath, the calm weight of rest settling upon you. And as you drift into sleep, remember, history is vast, filled with countless lives, countless stories. Tonight, you have wandered through one of them, gently, steadily, and now it is time to let the story close, and to find peace in the silence that follows. Good night.